Thank you so much for bearing with us. We apologize for the delay. I'm told that we're back in business, so now we're going to, we're not going to ask our candidates to repeat their opening statements. We're just going to dive right into it. So Mike and Lola, please take it away, and thanks for enduring our technical difficulties.
All right, thank you everyone. Can we just get a quick round of applause just to wake back up for a minute? Thank you so much for bearing with us. We really appreciate you coming out tonight to get things moving here. So we are going to jump right into our first block of questions here. In this section, for each of the candidates, you will have 60 seconds to answer questions. We do reserve the right to ask follow-ups, which should be answered in no more than 30 seconds. And our first series of questions tonight will focus on the right to abortion. The question facing Democrats now is, what's your plan? What would you do in Congress today to codify the right to abortion in law? Lieutenant Governor Gray, you go first.
My plan would be, sorry, there's a lot of, my plan would be to first, and I want to take a moment just to recognize Proposal 5, what we've done here in Vermont, encouraging Vermonters to get out, to spread the word, to prepare to vote in November, to codify our amendment. 2, in Congress, using my background as an assistant attorney general, my work in the federal judiciary, my experience as a lawyer, to bring people together, to do everything we can to codify Roe v. Wade. This means working across the aisle, building support, and making sure that we have the votes. In the Senate, absolutely right now, we need to end or abolish the filibuster and make sure we send the strongest majority to the Senate so that when something does pass the House, we also have the support in the Senate to take it up.
Thank you. Dr. Myers?
Is this on? Yeah. I think it's absolutely tragic ruling. It's going to cost lives. Obviously, the right to life, people will state that it will save the lives of unborn children, which may be true, but it is going to cost the lives of women, and it already has. We know that in states where healthcare is in least supply, and these are the states that are putting on the most draconian state laws in regards to abortion. These women in these states are generally lower income. They have predisposing medical conditions, and they simply cannot find care. So I would work in Congress to begin at least providing good prenatal and gynecologic and obstetric care where we can.
Thank you. Ms. Chase Clifford.
Well, we have to also acknowledge the fact that for millions across our country, Roe has not been a reality for folks who are covered by Medicaid and Medicare and TRICARE because of the Hyde Amendment, which restricts federal funding comprehensive reproductive care, inclusive of abortion care. Roe hasn't been a reality, and so that's predominantly low-income folks, it's predominantly folks of color. So the first thing we need to do is absolutely pass the Women's Health Protection Act, but in our appropriations bills, we need to rid them of these riders, the high
So I want to start by saying my anger is still very much real, and I want to be clear to people who may be listening, because I've learned in the last few days there are some young Vermonters that don't realize that abortion is still legal in Vermont. It is still legal because of a lot of the work that we did in the legislature to make sure that we codified it in statute, and of course, as we talked about earlier, the amendment that we'll be voting on in November to enshrine it in the Constitution. Very important for us to turn out for that. This is part of a 50-year effort that the Republicans have waged, and we knew this was coming. That's why we did the work here in Vermont. In terms of the work at the federal level that needs to be done, Yes, we need to codify Roe in statute, but we need court reform. Absolutely. We need to have on the table considering term limits, considering whether we should expand the court. Nothing should be off the table at this point. This is, as the doctor said, about people's lives.
Thank you. I want to ask a brief follow-up question to both Lieutenant Governor Gray and Senator Ballant. You both brought up Proposal 5, or the Reproductive Liberty Amendment, which is on the ballot this November in Vermont. That amendment would insulate the right to abortion from interference by a future Vermont legislature, but legal experts have noted that it would do nothing in the face of a federal abortion ban. If a Republican Congress and president were to attempt to pass such a ban in the future, what would you do to fight back? Lieutenant Governor Gray first.
Yeah, to begin with, I mean, we're in a situation where we have daily challenges to the right to privacy, to constitutional rights, trying to navigate the very best tools that we have at our disposal. The challenge with the Supreme Court's decision is that we just remove the floor, right? And states can always provide more rights, they can't provide less. So I do believe that Proposal 5 is still the best thing we can do in this moment. We need to work extremely hard, and this is why we have to make sure that we expand our majority in the Senate. We have to do everything we can to end the filibuster as well. But as the Vice President said just the other day in a briefing, we have to make sure that we do everything we can to keep the House as well.
Senator Ballant.
So while it's true that the amendment that we propose to the Constitution here in Vermont may not be able to withstand an onslaught from the federal government, it is still the best course of action at this point. And I think Vermonters need to know that we've done everything that we can do. So in terms of what we can do at the federal level, as I said, I really believe we need court reform, and we need to not accept the doomsayers that say that we're going to lose the House and that we don't have an opportunity to pick up another couple seats in the Senate. Americans are activated on this.
One other brief follow-up question, and I would ask candidates to just keep this to a yes or no answer. And Lieutenant Governor Gray, you already included this in your response, but I want to ask the other candidates on stage, do you support ending the Senate filibuster in order to pass a law codifying Roe v. Wade? Ms. Chase Clifford?
Yes, abolish the filibuster.
Senator Ballant?
Yes.
Dr.
Yes.
Miners?
No, I oppose ending filibuster.
Thank you.
Oh, I already-
Yes, you answered that question already. Thank you.
All right, New York Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said this weekend that 2 justices, Brett Kavanaugh and Neil Gorsuch, should be impeached for lying under oath in their confirmation hearings about their intention to overturn Roe v. Wade. The Congresswoman also discussed Justice Clarence Thomas's failure to recuse himself on cases concerning the 2020 election, despite his wife Ginny Thomas's efforts to overturn the results. Do you share the view that these 3 justices should be impeached? Why or why not? Senator Ballant.
I think, as I said earlier, I think everything needs to be on the table. Certainly, I have been watching these hearings and seeing just how much Ginny Thomas knew and how much she was close to what was happening January 6th. I think, of course, that gives us pause that he hasn't recused himself. So it is really important for the people who would be weighing in on this, which is, of course, our folks, our elected officials, to do due diligence. Can I say absolutely they should be impeached? No, I don't have that evidence yet, but we should be doing due diligence to make sure that the people who serve us are truly ethical people.
Ms. Chase Clifford.
Impeachment is the beginning of a process. It doesn't necessarily mean a conviction of the process. So I think impeachment, which is one of our checks and balances for the Supreme Court, should absolutely be pursued where there's due cause. Certainly, we saw on the record what folks had to say about what they said at the time was settled law of Roe, and we've seen their decision to be the opposite. So I believe that impeachment should be pursued where necessary.
Dr. Myers.
These 2 and possibly 3 justices, I think, have done great damage to the Supreme Court by not telling the truth during their confirmation hearings and in the meetings with the senators. I would not want to see us go down the impeachment process right now, path right now. I think we've had 2 impeachments attempts on President Trump, in recent years, and I think it would be divisive. I do think they could be censured, and I think we need a new code of ethics for the Supreme Court, and I think we need term limits.
Lieutenant Governor Gray.
Yeah, I think the shock of today, what we learned around Donald Trump and an attempted coup, I do recognize that we have members of this court, the highest court in the land, that is setting the law of our land, that doesn't respect fundamental rights, that doesn't accept and support established precedent, and who frankly may have lied under oath. And I think that is certainly worth exploring and understanding. I certainly believe that Justice Thomas may no longer be an impartial and unbiased adjudicator of the law. But my biggest concern right now is that we have to have a Congress that's acting on reestablishing fundamental rights, acting on gun violence in this country, acting on Ukraine, acting on inflation, acting on making sure that Vermonters and Americans are receiving the deep support that they need. So while I'm not opposed to an impeachment hearing, I wouldn't support that in this moment with all of the other issues that we have to address immediately.
All right, I want to ask a quick follow-up of the candidates, and Senator Ballant addressed this one, which is Supreme Court reforms, including imposing term limits and expanding the court. I'll go with Ms. Chase Clifford first.
We absolutely need to pursue court reform, and also it can't be an excuse for Congress to continue to pass the buck. We've seen Democratic leadership pass the buck to the Supreme Court, seen it pass it back to us voters, saying you need to vote harder, and it feels like excuses to not legislate and voraciously legislate. So while I do support court reform, more incentives for folks to retire, certainly term limits, we also need to make sure that Congress is still doing their job of legislating.
Lieutenant Governor Gray.
Yeah, reforming the court, in my mind, right now won't fix Congress. And what we have to do is fix Congress and make sure that it's working. That includes eliminating the filibuster, as I already mentioned, expanding our majority in the Senate, working to abolish the Electoral College, because frankly, I think that's also how we got here. I'm not opposed to Supreme Court reform, but I don't believe that's the issue that is before us right now.
Okay. Dr. Myers.
I think there's bipartisan support in Congress for term limits for Supreme Court justices from everything I've read. They're talking about an 18-year term, which would be substantial. I think we also have to remember federal judges who have immense power in this country, and those are lifetime appointments. So you have federal judges in their 70s and 80s still sitting and hearing cases. So I think the term limit should also extend to federal judges.
Thank you. Our next question, you'll have 60 seconds here. Justice Thomas released a concurring opinion Friday suggesting that the logic of the decision overturning Roe v. Wade could also provide a path for the court to reverse landmark cases guaranteeing the rights to contraception and same-sex marriage. What steps would you take now to protect those rights? Dr. Myers, we'll stay with you.
Well, I think this is a huge concern, and I think, frankly, I think it's a concern for the Republicans too. I think they're already going to get some blowback on this Supreme Court decision. I think if the Supreme Court goes down this path, it will be political disaster for the Republicans as well, and for our nation. I think it falls under some of the same categories as what we've been discussing for abortions, which is do everything possible to try and create federal laws which will protect these and be ironclad against any further Supreme Court intervention.
Thank you. Ms. Chase Clifford?
We have a faction of our political system that has been aiming for the absolute stars in terms of the most sweeping legislative reform possible, and aiming at dismantling some of the most core rights that we now have. And so what we must do within the Democratic Party is stop telling folks we're asking for too much when we're asking for things like Medicare for all, we're asking for things like universal housing, and making sure that we're actually protecting folks' rights, because that's certainly how we got here as well. We have an establishment that is so set in politics as usual and telling folks, listen, things are gonna be fine, don't worry. When we have so much at risk, so we need to act, we need to actually leverage political capital that we have. And when we talk about why the House might lose seats, why we might lose the majority, we have to talk about why. So we campaign on these issues and fundraise on these issues and don't actually deliver. We need to continue to do the work of actually legislating and delivering on these continual decades-long campaign promises.
Thank you. Senator Ballin.
This has been a really hard week for me, watching the news about the Clarence Thomas. I don't have word for it. He is trying to drag us back 50 years. And as someone who had to fight really hard here in Vermont to marry my spouse, to have that now called into question, have my children asking about that, never thought that we would be here again in my lifetime. And so we have to pass a more robust Equality Act so that students and children across this country feel like their country is standing with them, is looking out for them and has their back, and that's not what we see right now.
Thank you. Lieutenant Governor Gray.
What Justice Thomas, I believe, was getting at was the right to privacy rights. And I can tell you, from my experience as an attorney, that these are rights related to access to contraceptives, to equal marriage, to who you love. I think that the next set of rights may be voting rights. We don't know where this court will stop, and Justice Thomas gave a glimpse of where they're headed. And so what does that mean? That means that we do need leaders in Congress. I know that there are rooms where being a lawyer is not popular, but I think right now we need more lawyers in Washington who are ready to uphold and protect constitutional rights, who understand fundamental rights, who understand what we can do in federal law to get to work as quickly as possible codifying, and recognizing that these rights don't just impact women, they impact men, they impact our LGBTQ community, they impact Black and brown Americans and Vermonters, they impact everyone in this room, in this state, and across the country. And we have to get back to recognizing that and building the strongest coalitions possible to make sure Congress can codify these rights and protect them.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Now we'll provide an opportunity for candidates to ask one another questions. Each candidate may ask another candidate of their choosing one question. These should be questions and not speeches. You will have 60 seconds to answer, and we may ask or allow for follow-up questions. Senator Valent, you get to go first. Who would you like to query, and what is your question?
I would like to ask Lieutenant Governor Gray a question. Go ahead. Thank you. You said in a debate earlier this spring that the biggest mistake you made was not voting for almost a decade, including the critical election of 2016. And I appreciate that you said that because voting is so important. But I feel like the heart of that issue for me is that you weren't honest with voters about your record. The last time you were in front of Vermonters asking for their vote, PolitiFact and VTDigger reported that when you said that you voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, that wasn't in fact true. And so I'm wondering if you think that that perhaps was the bigger mistake, and do you think that you owe Vermonters an apology for not being truthful about your voting record in 2020?
Thank you, Senator Ballin. Let me be really clear. In 2016, I was overseas. I didn't have a plan to vote. I've acknowledged that. I waited to the last minute, and that will always be on me, always. I believe what we have to focus on now is doing everything we can to make sure, one, that elections are fully accessible. Right now, we know that here in Vermont, ballots are out. We don't have vote by mail. You know that I've been a strong champion for vote by mail. We do have same-day registration, so Vermonters can go to the polls and vote and register and vote on the same day. That's extremely important. But in Congress, I want to tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to be a champion for voting rights. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure we pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Make sure we do everything we can to make sure that same-day registration and vote by mail is accessible to not only every Vermonter, but every American. That's what I'm going to do.
Could we pause until this is figured out? I think it's been pretty distracting for folks.
And thank you for bearing with us. I think Dr. Myers, you get to go next.
Oh, may I have a follow-up?
Sure. A quick follow-up.
Thank you. I understand that you regret not voting, but that's not actually what I asked. What I asked was, do you feel like you owe Vermonters an apology for not being truthful about voting in the 2016 election?
If anyone felt like I was being untruthful, I'm sincerely sorry, and I've explained my reasoning. And I believe we could talk about this for the rest of the election. We could talk about it again and again and again. I think what's most important right now is that we focus on the issues.
Dr. Myers, who would you like to ask a question to?
I'll direct to Senator Ballot. Since 1968, the Republicans have been very good at presenting a united front in terms of their policy and politics. As Democrats, we may not like that. The Democrats since 1968 have generally formed circular firing squads, often between the moderates and progressives. And we've taken some huge political losses because of that. If you're elected, you're a progressive, what would you do, not necessarily just crossing the aisle, within your own side of the aisle to work with moderates within the Democratic Congressional Caucus?
I really appreciate the question because I think it's incredibly important, and there were people talking with me about this very issue as I was coming in today. And what I would say to you, Dr. Myers, is that I have a record of doing just that. I have had to bring together disparate wings of my party within the Senate over and over again to override gubernatorial vetoes, to pass gun legislation, to pass reproductive rights. We run within our own caucus here in Vermont from Blue Dog Democrats to hard P progressives. And I am a progressive Democrat, but I am a Democrat, and I am also pragmatic. And that will be the way that I lead in Congress. And it is better for us to get work done than to try to get everything every time.
Ms. Chase Clifford.
I have one question for two candidates, so perhaps I'll ask one now and another. And am I allowed to ask two
I'll
candidates?
allow it.
Thank you, Lola. Well, my question is, and I'll keep it short. I've heard multiple candidates on the stage talk about how we need to get big money out of politics, and I certainly agree. First, I would like to ask Senator Ballot, what do you think constitutes big money, and do you think that campaigns have a responsibility to, at some point, stop fundraising?
Oh, such an interesting question. So the first part is what constitutes big money.
Yes.
Okay. So from my perspective, I've never taken corporate donations in any of my campaigns, including this one. I think taking money from individuals who are not in line with my values, but are willing to max out to my campaign, that is not taking that is taking money that is not true to my values. I think having a campaign funded by a lot of DC insider lobbyists is not good for the democratic process. I think Citizens United has completely and totally upended the way that we fund campaigns in this country, and we need to have a viable public funding system. That's what I believe, that's what I want to get to.
So just to clarify, you believe that campaigns can have unlimited funds as long as they're from people that are value aligned?
I think the question is, do you have enough money to get your message out? That's what I'm up against. I'm up against a system that doesn't really reward people like me, regular people. I'm a teacher from Windham County.
I'm sorry, I think we should move along.
I would like to ask the same question of Lieutenant Governor Gray.
What to you constitutes big money? And do you believe that campaigns have a responsibility at some point to stop fundraising?
I think I've been pretty clear. I think super PACs are considered very big money, and for Vermonters who don't know what super PACs are, they're independent expenditure PACs. They have unlimited spending ability. They're not accountable. They're not elected. They can come into any race. Right now, we've seen over $60 million spent by super PACs in Democratic primaries across this country. I think that's some pretty big money, and we already know that one super PAC has spent $11 million in a race in Oregon.
Okay, it seems to what I've heard is personal campaign contributions or campaign funds aren't necessarily big money. It's only where you get the money that counts as big money, is I think what I've heard, but I will yield the balance of my time.
Lieutenant Governor Gray.
My question is for Senator Fallon. Senator, you didn't file personal financial disclosures on time as required by law in this race. Second, you know your campaign, or you didn't know if your campaign was accepting contributions, I think you just said from DC lobbyists, but you are. Third, you said you were unaware that your campaign put up a red box to guide super PAC spending in this race. You've taken it down. Fourth, your campaign says it was unaware that a super PAC run by a crypto billionaire had endorsed you. Now you know, yet you've refused to publicly reject the endorsement. My question is, what should Vermonters make of your lack of awareness, both about the laws candidates and members of Congress must follow, and about who is supporting your campaign?
So that feels like 4 questions, and I'll try to take them in order. So the first thing I want to say is, when you are running for office, you have to file a disclosure form with the House Ethics Committee. It's 120 pages long, just the directions. So we asked for an extension, which many, many candidates do. They asked for extensions. We were granted the extension. All of it is in good order. There were no concerns. So that is not part of any kind of, I think you're insinuating a pattern, and that is certainly not indication of a pattern. In terms of your bringing up the issue of red boxing, I have said that on my campaign website, there was a page that showed the distinctions between the two of us in this race. And as soon as there was any question about whether that was something that I had never heard of, which is red boxing, I instructed my team to take it down, because that is not the campaign I'm running.
Sorry, I think there's 2 other points there. I mean, I think leadership is really about taking responsibility. And I guess will you take responsibility right now for the actions of your campaign, both in publicly rejecting the super PAC endorsement and also pledging to file your overdue financial disclosures?
I didn't catch the second part.
And also, 1, publicly rejecting the endorsement of the super PAC that has endorsed you, and 2, filing the overdue personal financial disclosures that are required by law as a candidate and also as a member of Congress.
Okay, so I will say to all of you here, I have never benefited from a super PAC. There is only one candidate up here who has benefited from any super PAC spending, and that is Lieutenant Governor Molly Gray in the 2020 election. Tens of thousands of dollars were spent to support her campaign by a super PAC, and there was no—
Senator, please wrap it up.
There was no denunciation at that time. I would also like us to get back to talking about the issues.
Sorry, I don't think she answered the question. There was no—
I'm gonna cut it off.
Okay. I was mentioned, and I also think I could take time in the next question if you prefer.
There's been a lot of that.
Okay.
Thank you. We are returning to questions for each of the candidates. And again, with these questions, we'll ask you to keep your responses to 60 seconds. Americans are struggling with the rising costs of food, fuel, and other goods, and a gas tax holiday pitched by President Biden last week is expected to have only a minimal impact Our incumbent Congressman Peter Welch has said fuel costs could have an even greater impact on Vermonters when it's time to heat their homes this winter. If you were in Congress right now, what would you be doing to address the root causes of inflation and provide relief to consumers? Dr. Myers, we'll start with you.
First of all, I think that even a temporary waiving of the gas tax would be temporary, would not provide much help. And we have to remember the gas tax pays for much of our road building and road repair, and it has lost a great deal of its value in the last 25 years because Congress has not raised the rate. So I think that we shouldn't be tapping into the gas tax for any lengthy period of time. I think that President Biden is making some efforts to try and control inflation. It's unfortunate that we got behind the curve. I think I wish he would replace Secretary of Treasury Yellen with Larry Summers, who sounded the alarm on inflation over a year ago. I think waiving some of the tariffs that we have with other countries around the world, particularly China, at least on a temporary basis, would have a significant impact at this time.
Thank you. Senator Ballant, same question.
So I just want to acknowledge that Vermonters, I know across the state, are really struggling with inflation. I do the grocery shopping every week on Saturday morning with my son, and I've seen the rising costs of just about everything. So I know Vermonters want relief. I certainly understand the president's desire to have a gas tax holiday. I have concerns it's not actually going to get to the people who need the relief, and it's just going to be more of a boon to fossil fuel companies. But there are things that we can do. So we need to stop price gouging. I support Senator Warren's proposal to prohibit companies from raising the cost of goods and services by more than 10%. This is a good start. Congress should also immediately impose a windfall tax on fossil fuel companies. They are raking it in hand over fist while Vermonters are struggling. We also have to make more goods here at home. Part of the issue of inflation right now is the supply chain issue, and we can really invest in our supply chain here at home. All these things will help.
Thank you. Lieutenant Governor Gray, same question.
Sure, thank you. I do want to state really clearly on the record, when I ran for Lieutenant Governor in 2020, I did not welcome super PACs. I did not invite them into the race. I didn't want them in the race. I don't want them in this race. And when I get to Congress, I'll be working with Senator Sanders to put them out of business. Super PACs have absolutely no place in our Vermont elections. But to the question at hand, as Lieutenant Governor, I've heard from Vermonters every single day. Vermonters on fixed incomes who are trying to navigate Social Security that just doesn't cover the bill. Vermonters who are trying to afford prescription drug costs. Vermonters who are trying to afford child care. So it's not only about what we can do right now at the federal level, working with the Federal Reserve, but what we can do to make sure that Vermonters' needs are being met. Addressing child care, addressing prescription drug costs, ending fossil fuel subsidies, doing what we can to invest in live heat, and looking at the COLA cost of living adjustment on Social Security.
Thank you. Ms. Chase Clever.
Immediate windfall tax and stop subsidies to the fossil fuel companies, and that has to be done immediately. But also, we need to make sure that our families can afford to live at all times. For too long, things have always been expensive and out of reach for so many communities. And so that means we need to finally pass a livable wage that permanently adjusts to inflation so folks can actually afford to save. We need to make sure that we have housing investment so people don't see over 50% of their monthly income go to housing costs. We need universal health care. We need Medicare for all so folks don't see thousands and thousands of dollars leaving their paychecks to pay for premiums and copays. We have to build the baseline resiliency of our communities because there are certainly inflationary pressures that we can't control, but a strong economy requires economically resilient families.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. The shooting last month at an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas, has reignited a public debate about the use of certain school hardening tactics meant to keep children safe. Those include practices like active shooter drills, surveillance technology, as well as the use of school resource officers, or police officers stationed in schools. Should Congress continue to appropriate federal funding for school resource officers? And what other measures do you see as necessary or appropriate to keep schools safe? Senator Ballant.
So I want to start by saying, as a parent, I talk to a lot of parents right now who don't feel comfortable and safe dropping their kids off at school anymore. I just want to acknowledge that what we're experiencing right now is not normal. We do not have to watch the slaughter of our children and have that be the price of our freedom and our liberty. And so we have to stop feeling like we have to accept this. And so I think at these times, people feel like the solution is hardening schools. That is not the solution. The solution are sensible gun laws that impact communities. And so I think it's interesting right now that we're hearing about hardening of schools and arming teachers when just a few months ago, we had some of these same legislators in Congress say that we couldn't trust teachers to pick their own curriculum. And so we need to focus on sensible gun laws that gets the hands out of dangerous people in our communities. That's where our focus should be.
Dr. Myers?
I've been on the record for some time in supporting school resource officers. Obviously in Uvalde, it did not work as we would have hoped, even though they eventually got the gunmen, too many children were killed. But I think if my children were still school age, I would want a armed school resource officer in the school. Mental health counseling for children in the schools is essential. We need to increase funding for that. Many of these young shooters have come out of the same school system they return to shoot it up. And of course, the larger issue is the gun laws, which we could talk about all evening.
All right, Ms. Chase Clifford.
School hardening is incredibly traumatic for the students and staff, and the data that supports school resource officers is just not there. The data that they actually make schools safer is not clear and is just not there. What is clear is that predominantly school hardening impacts students of color, students with disabilities, LGBTQ+ students, and particularly the students at the intersection of those identities. I'm very proud to have worked on the Counseling Not Criminalization in Schools Act in Congress, and that bill is incredibly important because it takes funding from school resource officers and instead invests it in making sure every school in our nation has adequate ratios of social workers, school psychologists, nurses, and trauma-informed behavioral health professionals, because that's what we know actually makes schools safer and actually supports student development, and that's where our resources need to be in systems that work.
Lieutenant Governor Gray?
I think the biggest challenge is that we're placing the security of our children on teachers and schools rather than addressing the underlying and root cause of gun violence in this country, which is that we don't have common sense gun reform, common sense gun laws at the national level. We've done some good work here in the state, but nationally we have to do so much more. So what does that look like? One, it means building the support to close the Charleston loophole, expanding background checks, expanding 24-hour waiting periods, making red flag laws, which we have here in Vermont, the extreme risk protection orders, a reality at the federal level nationally, focusing on safe storage, and then really understanding that where we can provide the most support to schools right now is actually what Dr. Myers was saying, in mental health and support services for kids who are still reeling from this pandemic, making sure that we're fully recognizing what is it that our schools offer. I was in Randolph where a health clinic was built into the school. It's school meals, it's a safe place, and it's a place where students should really be able to learn.
Can you answer the question just yes or no? Should Congress continue to appropriate federal funding for school resource officers?
At this moment, until we have common sense gun reform, yes.
Thank you. Our next question. Lawmakers have considered a range of proposals for dealing with student debt, from targeted loan forgiveness to wholesale cancellation of debt. How would you deal with the current burden of student debt while working to make higher education more affordable in the long run? Lieutenant Governor Gray will stay with you.
Sure, I have 60 seconds?
60 seconds.
Well, as someone who graduated law school with $125,000 in debt, this isn't a theoretical issue, it's a personal issue for me. I was talking to a Vermonter in Rutland who recently said, my student loan debt is like a mortgage on my life. So until we address student loan debt, we know Vermonters and Americans are going to be making challenging decisions about when to have kids, about whether or not to buy a home or to afford a home. I do support a number of different proposals out there. I do believe we need to eliminate a portion of student debt, not all of it, but the bigger challenge that we face is how do we reform our education system so that we don't have students coming out of school with 125K, and I was one of the lucky ones, but rather we have associate's degrees that are available for free in high demand sectors. We have tuition repayment for individuals who go into the jobs that we need filled right here in Vermont, that we have free community college. We've piloted some incredible programs here in the state, and so while I support addressing student loan debt, I also know in tandem we have to address access to higher education.
Thank you. Ms. Chase Clifford, same question.
Our communities need immediate relief, and we need to pursue as broad of student debt cancellation as possible. This is also a core economic justice issue and a racial justice issue, because we know Black and brown borrowers are disproportionately burdened by student debt and are more likely to default on their student debt. And we also know that millennials like myself are over 50% of us say that because of our student debt burdens, we're not able to qualify for mortgages, and if we were, we wouldn't be able to afford both our student debt payments and our mortgage payments. So this is burdening our entire communities. So we need that immediate relief in wholesale cancellation, and we do need to pursue legislation like the Free College for All Act and making sure folks up to a certain income threshold are able to access higher education for free so they can actually cash in on this perennial promise that we've told folks that if you go to higher education and if you pursue a degree, that's your ticket out of intergenerational poverty. And so far we've been punishing folks for pursuing that goal. We need to liberate our communities so they can actually cash in and be able to be a part of what we've sold as the American dream.
Senator Ballin.
Yes, we need to cancel a significant amount of the student debt. 45 million Americans right now are carrying $1.6 trillion in student loan debt. That's not just hurting individuals, that's not just hurting families and communities, that's hurting all of us. That's having a tremendous drag on the economy. As Lieutenant Governor said, people don't feel like they can have children at this point. We're hearing a lot of the same stories out on the campaign trail, so it's holding us all back. I had significant student loan debts, but nothing compared to what folks are carrying now. It's different. And so we need absolutely to cancel debt. We need to make school more affordable. The other thing I want us to be thinking about is that we should not be charging interest over 2% on student loans. So many people are struggling right now to get ahead. They are told that getting an education is the way to do it, and then they're saddled with this crushing debt. And generations that came before did not have to deal with this. It's patently not fair, and we can make a difference.
Thank you. Dr. Myers.
I agree with Senator Ballin. I think we should be capping interest rates on these loans. I think President Biden is promoting income-based loans, which will place loans congruent to what people earn in their salaries in their careers, so that people can go into the helping professions, for example, without having to be with having relative lower debt. He's going after the for-profit colleges. These fly-by-night places are just scamming students and not giving degrees and charging, putting them hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. But I think basically if we don't control the cost of college, we're going to be right back in the situation. We can wipe out every bit of debt, college debt tomorrow, but if colleges continue to charge $75,000 to $100,000 a year in tuition, the next cohort of students is going to be in the same situation. So I think we have to work on the cost, bringing down the cost of colleges.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. We will now provide another opportunity for candidates to ask one another questions. Each candidate may ask another candidate one question of their choosing. These should be questions, not speeches. I'm going to repeat that. These should be questions, not speeches. You'll have 60 seconds to answer, and we may ask or allow for follow-up questions. Ms. Chase Clifford, you get to go first.
Great. I have just a question for one person. Senator Ballin, in one of your more recent ads, it's about addressing gun violence, and at the end you say we can stop gun violence, which is a great message, but I would like to know, especially if you don't get the opportunity to talk about it tonight, what is your specific plan to end all gun violence?
So obviously it is aspirational. And I think that has to be the aspiration that we have, because we have decided that we will just live with this. And so we have made significant strides here in Vermont. We were told that it was the third rail of politics here in Vermont, that we couldn't pass gun violence prevention bills, and we did. And so I would love to see red flag laws across the nation. I would love to see us close the Charleston loophole. I would like to see us make sure that domestic violence, that we deal with the issue of domestic violence and making sure that those folks who should not have access to a firearm don't. There are lots of levers that we can move in order to make progress on this. But I think fundamentally, we need in Congress for people to show some courage and stand up to the gun lobby. It has taken 25 years to get something passed finally, and it's not significant what it was just passed. It's not significant. So it is aspirational, but I think we have to do this work.
Do you think that as a state we did all we could to close the Charleston loophole?
No, absolutely not. We did as much as we could. It goes to what Dr. Myers was talking about, is that when you're trying to craft legislation and you have a governor who vetoes your work, you have to figure out how to work across the aisle and within your caucus to get the votes to override. So, no, there's more to do.
All right, Lieutenant Governor Gray.
I have a question about, for Senator Ballin about paid family and medical leave. I'm running for Congress in large part because of paid family and medical leave. It's personal to me. I think it's a huge issue for our state. Becca, on your website, you claim that you've helped pass a paid family and medical leave bill, yet, as we know here in Vermont, there's no bill, and it's not accessible to Vermonters. We know we've seen a disproportionate number of women leave the workforce during the pandemic because of a lack of paid leave. So why did the Senate, this last session, not act on paid leave?
We did act on paid leave. It was part of a package that was sent to the House, and it didn't survive the conference committee. So we have continued to work on this issue. We passed it multiple times in the Senate, and as you know, you need both chambers, and you need a governor who's willing to do the work. I will tell you, like you, we share this. We share this passion on paid family leave. It is something that workers need. It is something that women need, and we are, as you have said, we are in the sandwich generation of taking care of our parents and our children. So it is the work that we've done year after year. We thought we had a willing partner in the governor, and we did not.
I guess my follow-up, though, is I don't recall as president of the Senate signing any bills that would go to the governor with a standalone paid family and medical leave plan. And so I'm just curious why the Senate didn't take up paid leave this year as a standalone bill when we knew we had, I believe, the highest number of women leaving the workforce in the nation. We've had a very high number of unpaid caregivers, and possibly the votes to override a veto.
The governor's position had not changed, and we had done significant outreach to the executive branch about that. If you recall, we were supposed to have a paid family leave program that was coupled between Vermont and New Hampshire, and that never came to pass. So we've done everything that we can do with this particular governor. And the folks who will be in that chamber after I leave are going to continue this fight long after I'm gone, because it is important. We do need this, and that's why I'll be fighting for it in Congress.
Dr. Myers.
Question for Lieutenant Governor Gray. President Biden has done, I think, a very good job of pulling together an international coalition in terms of giving help to Ukraine, and he's provided a great deal of logistics and armaments. He has strenuously avoided direct confrontation with Russia. Right now, Putin controls the Azov and the Black Seas, and he's has millions, and he's preventing millions of tons of grain in Ukraine from being exported to people who are starving around the world. If President Biden wanted to provide a military Navy convoy to get that grain out, would you support it?
I don't believe that's a decision for President Biden to make on his own. And I think this really gets to the heart of Congress's role. And and what I know, having spent half a decade working in Congress, working for the International Committee of the Red Cross as a Congressional Affairs Associate, and really understanding that Congress has a massive role to play in deciding when we go to war. I think that Congress has done a good job right now of understanding the importance of providing military assistance, security assistance, most importantly, humanitarian assistance. My generation has largely lived in war for the entirety of my professional career. I think that there's a significant oversight role for Congress also to play, and in this decision, it's one where Congress would, I believe, would need to be involved. Because I believe it may include putting individuals close to battle, and that is escalating us and putting the United States potentially in the position of engaging in a war directly, in which Congress would have to decide and vote.
Okay, Senator Ballant, you get to go.
So it's a question for Lieutenant Governor. As has been reported many times in the press, and as you well know, the Lieutenant Governor is a largely ceremonial position. The office doesn't have the power to vote on legislation, to pass legislation, to deliver on legislation, and your office chose not to engage as active participants in the development and passage of legislation. In your 18 months since you have been elected, which concrete policies have you advanced, and what would you say was your top priority that you were able to advance?
Sure, I appreciate this question because I think it brings it back to how do our branches of government work here in Vermont. The Lieutenant Governor is a member of the executive branch, kind of like the Vice President. I have to be ready at any point to step in and serve should something happen to the governor. I preside over the Senate. As you know, we've been working together pretty much day in and day out over the last couple of years. My vote opportunities, when there's a tie-breaking vote, I serve on the Committee on Committees, so help to set all of the committee assignments for the Senate, and I sign every single bill that goes to the governor. Out of tremendous respect for the pro tem, for the Speaker of the House, my role has largely been being the eyes and ears, being out in communities, listening, trying to understand what your needs are, and then bringing back to the State House the issues that I believe are most important to Vermonters. I was deeply proud to spend much of the last year after the Senate session completed out in community, listening, engaging, trying to understand from all of you how you believe we should spend $2.7 billion coming to Vermont. And I was very proud to draft a report for Senator Ballant, and I can outline the issues that were in there and the recommendations if that would be helpful this evening, but also for the Speaker and for the governor. And I was very pleased to sit down with the governor and go through those issues line by line. I believe that we're all on Team Vermont, and the Lieutenant Governor's role is a unique one. But when I'm in Congress, I will continue working with the congressional delegation, certainly as a member of Congress, with the governor, and with the legislature.
Follow up?
Sure.
I don't think you want to, Lola.
Make it quick.
Okay, I'll make it quick. So I just want to get back to the question, which was, can you point to a way that you used your office to advance legislation that you said were top priorities?
Sure,
for you?
absolutely. So let me go through the priorities that were in the report that I wrote for you.
You did not write it for me.
I wrote
You wrote a report and you sent it by email, and that is okay. But leadership is about following through on ideas and bringing them to fruition. So I would like to know what you did in your role as Lieutenant Governor to help bring these ideas to fruition on workforce,
Questions,
on housing.
not speeches.
Thank you. Thank you, Lola.
Yeah, issue number one was workforce. Issue number two is housing, childcare, broadband and cellular service access for Vermonters, mental health and support services, with concrete recommendations for you, whether you believe that or not, for the Speaker, and you're the President of the Senate. So my job is not to undercut your authority or your leadership over your body, right? In the same way that we don't want Kamala Harris walking into the House and telling members of the House what to do, right? So I believe I've used my role as a member of the executive branch to the very best of my ability, not only to preside over the Senate, to help with our COVID response, to be an extra set of eyes and ears for legislators,
I'm very
meeting
sorry.
quietly,
I'm
working.
cut you off.
Okay, but it's an important question, and I feel like Senator Ballin's trying to undermine my leadership and service as
You were-
Lieutenant Governor
you
of
were
Vermont.
given your time to respond.
Thank you all. We have one final segment with the Democratic candidates tonight. That will be our lightning round. Each of you will have a chance to answer these questions, but please do so in just a few words. Here we go. Last year, Congress restored earmarks to the federal appropriations process. These allow individual members of Congress to dole out significant government funding to local institutions of their choosing. They've also been criticized as being ripe for corruption. Do you support earmarks? Dr. Myers, first.
I think both of those are accurate. They are corruptible, but I do support them because I think at least it gives a chance for people to begin compromising with each other.
Thank you.
And moving forward.
Thank you. Lieutenant Governor Gray?
Working in Congress, I've seen what happens when earmarks go away, and now that they're back, I think the important thing is that they actually allow for a lot of transparency. What senators are requesting what for which parts of their state. It allows for transparency, it allows for accountability, so I actually think it's a good thing that they're back.
Thank you. Senator Ballin?
Yes, and as Dr. Myers said, it is something we have to watch in terms of it being corruptible, but this is a useful tool for getting work done.
Ms. Chase Clifford?
Yes, I was working in Congress when they came back, and they have created new measures to make sure there's more transparency, so yes.
Thank you. Do you support ending qualified immunity for law enforcement officers at the federal level? Ms. Chase Clifford, we'll stay with you.
Yes.
Dr. Myers?
Modified. I think that it serves, I think we have to modify it, but I don't think we should abolish it entirely.
Thank you. Lieutenant Governor Gray?
I'm open to exploring it as a step forward, but not without a full consideration of ending qualified immunity for all public officials.
Thank you. Senator Ballin?
Yes.
If one of Vermont's U.S. Senate seats opened up in the next election cycle, would you run for it, or would you continue to build relationships and seniority in the House? Dr. Myers?
I'm at a stage of life where I'm not going to be a career politician, so I would prefer to stay in the House and get some effective work done.
Thank you. Senator Ballin?
I'm eager to be in the House because it's much more functional right now. And I always say, you never know what's around the corner, so I'm not going to say, I'm just trying to get this incredibly audacious thing done, which is trying to get to the House. That's what I'm focused on.
Lieutenant Governor Gray?
I can't imagine right now running another campaign, but no, I can't imagine it right now.
Ms. Chase Clifford?
I still wouldn't be old enough.
Next question. Do you believe Donald Trump should be prosecuted for his involvement in the insurrection on January 6th? Senator Ballin?
Well, so obviously it's not the role of the commission to prosecute. I think what we've seen, and especially what's come out today, I think there seems to be a tremendous amount of evidence that the Justice Department will have the evidence to do that. I think if a president has done the things that this president has done and does not face some kind of prosecution, then we are looking at the end of the republic.
Lieutenant Governor Gray?
As someone who's had to do a lot of prosecution reviews and make those decisions as an assistant attorney general, I don't envy this attorney general with the news that's come out today, what we know of Donald Trump and leading a coup effectively. My biggest fear is what if you try to prosecute and you can't win? And on this one, we'd have to win. So I think we need more evidence, but we will probably know more and more in the days ahead.
Dr. Myers?
I think there's legal matters and then there's political matters. I think legally it's looking more and more like he is prosecutable, but the politics of that could be very difficult.
Ms. Chase Clifford?
Yes.
Thank you. Our last question today comes from a reader. Elizabeth Hirsch of Windsor asks, what issue are you willing to lose this election over? Lieutenant Governor Gray?
I always ask this question, so I'm actually fine to have it asked of myself. Paid family medical leave. My mom has multiple sclerosis. I know what it's like to try to care for a loved one and try to pay the bills. And they always say you have to know what you're willing to lose over or take to the mat. And for me, it's paid family medical leave for every Vermonter and every American.
Thank you. Ms. Chase Clifford?
There's a lot of issues I feel really strongly about, but I'll certainly say it's healthcare. I'll certainly lose into that, but there's a lot of them.
Thank you. Senator Ballin.
I would say you have to, as an elected official, be ready to lose your seat on every single vote. That's how serious the job is. But certainly for me, firearms is a big one.
Dr. Myers.
Well, we haven't talked much about healthcare, but that is my passion, and I'm going to work to bring back independent practices, primary care, and make our healthcare more efficient and more affordable.
Thank you.
Thank you all. That concludes our debate with the Democratic candidates for U.S. House. Thanks again to Senator Rebecca Ballin, Sinead Chase Clifford, Lieutenant Governor Gray, Molly Gray, and Dr. Lewis Myers. We're going to ask these 4 candidates to leave the stage and take their seats. Meanwhile, we will invite our Republican candidates to join us, and as soon as they get seated, we'll begin the second portion of our program.
We're going to make this
so sorry. There you go. I did it. Jordan's what I'm looking at.
Yeah, I got it.
I took credit for that. Okay, there you go. You got it on the first. This is like me driving like down the road. Yeah. My buddy. On the first few weeks. Oh, I mean. This is awesome.
Started again with the second portion of our debate here. Thanks everyone for sticking with us. We are going to get started in just a moment. Lola, take it away.
All right. We are now joined by the 3 candidates in the Republican primary for U.S. House. Liam Madden is a Marine Corps veteran and former leader of Iraq Veterans Against the War. He works in the solar energy industry and lives in Bellows Falls. Erica Reddick is an accountant based in Burlington, and Anya Tinio of Derby is the vice chair of the Orleans County Republican Committee. We'll follow roughly the same format for this portion of the debate. We plan to allow for the same number of questions as in the first half, but we expect this portion to run a bit shorter since we have only 3 candidates. Some questions will be the same as those asked of the Democratic candidates, and some will vary. We'll start with opening statements. While introducing yourselves to voters, please tell us what you see as the most pressing issue facing Vermonters right now, and why you are the best candidate to address that issue in Congress. You will each have 60 seconds. Erica Reddick, you get to go first.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with everyone today and to get to speak to Vermonters. I think anyone who is watching might say that the economy is the most pressing issue we are facing. When people can't afford to put gas in their car, when they are searching for baby formula, when they can't find housing, clearly we're having a problem with our economy. And a lot of people don't realize this, but 16% of suicides are actually related to financial problems. And so when we talk about what do we need to do to make sure that Vermonters are not only able to take care of themselves, but also mentally and physically well, we have to talk about the economy and what needs to be put in place. I've been helping small businesses and individuals for the last 21 years make good financial decisions as an accountant and small business consultant. And I will do the same thing in Washington to get control of the out of control spending, the inflation, and our $30 trillion debt.
Okay, Anya Tinio, you get to go next.
I think there's a variety of issues that we're facing right now that are most pressing: constitutional rights, affordability, economic growth, parental rights. All of those things are very pressing. I'm the best candidate for this position because we're going to need a representative in Vermont, for Vermont, that is willing to make the hard decisions to mitigate these problems for you. I have a demonstrated history of standing up for what I am sent to stand up for. I am the vice chair of the Orleans County Republican Committee. I am also the committee woman for the Orleans County GOP to the state party. And I sat on the platform committee earlier this year. And as I said, I have a demonstrated history of fighting for you, fighting for what I believe is right to help you, and being successful at it. I will be a strong representative for the state of Vermont, a very active representative, and a very effective representative. Thank you all for being here tonight.
Liam Madden, you get to go next.
Hi, fellow Vermonters. My name is Liam Madden. As a Marine, I risked my life for our country. And as a leader of the nation's largest anti-war organization of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, I also risked my life to ensure our country does what is right. I do not believe there is a most pressing issue that affects every Vermonter, but I will speak for myself. I am a renewable energy professional and the co-winner of MIT's Solve Award for Sustainability Solutions. And I believe I bring a unique credibility as the only person with that perspective in this election to say what is alarming to me is that no one is mentioning from either party that this fact is real. Our economy is completely dependent on energy. And if we are to use the same amount of economic growth, if we were to grow our economy at 3% a year for the next 30 years, we will use the same amount of energy as we have in the last 10,000. And that is impossible. And we need a new economic paradigm, and that is what I will help us achieve as Vermont's representative.
Okay, thank you all. We'll now turn to questions for all of you, some of which have been submitted or suggested by VTDigger readers. You will each have 60 seconds to answer, and we reserve the right to ask follow-up questions, which should be answered in no more than 30 seconds. Our first question tonight, again, we'll start this segment by discussing the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. Do you support the decision issued by the court last week, and why or why not? Ms. Reddick?
Oh, that's significantly more simple than the question that the Democrats got. I do support the overturning of Roe versus Wade by the Supreme Court. Even Ruth Bader Ginsburg warned Americans that if they wanted to preserve the right to abortion, it would need to be done through the legislative process. And they have not successfully done that in the last 50 years. And so really Democrats, have only themselves to blame if they're concerned about this right no longer being available. You know, even the justices who passed it said it was very flimsy law. And so I think when we're looking at preserving our institutions, we need to rely on our Supreme Court to be making decisions about whether or not laws are constitutional or not. That is really their only job. They should not be legislating from the bench, which is what they did with the Roe versus Wade decision.
Thank you. Ms. Tinio.
I do support the overturning of Roe v. Wade. It returned the decisions back to the states. I'm a huge states' rights person. And as a pro-life American, I also support it on that level.
Thank you. Mr. Madden.
I do not support the overturning of Roe v. Wade. However, I think the best place to start this discussion is to remind people that people who are pro-life also support women having choice over their own bodies, and people who are pro-choice also support babies being welcomed into this world with families who love them and take care of them and choose them. And I think if we start there, we can have conversations that actually cover new ground, which is what we need. But my primary logic as a public servant is that it is a dangerous precedent for the government to have influence over our own medical decisions. And I think pre-fetal viability, a woman's right to control her own health care is a right. And after a fetus becomes viable, I acknowledge that this is a more morally and legally complicated issue, and I would prefer the state I live in protect the right of a woman to choose her own reproduction decisions, but I would see it as a reasonable compromise after viability to allow states to decide this issue.
Thank you. I want to ask a brief follow-up to each of you. For Ms. Reddick and Ms. Tinio, since you said you support that decision, I want to know just yes or no, if a federal abortion ban were proposed in Congress, would you vote for that?
A federal abortion ban? I would not vote for that either. And I would like to give a reason why,
Sure,
if that's
please.
okay. First of all, number one, I just said it's a state's issue. This should not be legislated by the Supreme Court. So I would not support a ban. But I would also say that the taking of an innocent life is actually already protected under law. And so I'm unclear why we would need an additional law to do that.
Thank you. Ms. Tinio, same question?
I would support a ban because we are talking about two lives. A woman's right to choose for her own body is one subject. There is another life involved here, and I would support that ban. However, at this point, it's a states' rights issues. I would like to see it go to the states and be legislated on within state legislature.
Thank you. Mr. Madden, since you said you do not support this decision, I wanted to ask, what would you do as a member of Congress to then protect abortion rights, if anything? And if you can answer in 30 seconds, please.
I agree with what Erica said, that this should be a legislated issue. This should not be something that the courts decide. And I would support making that legislation that did what I just suggested, creating a compromise where the woman's right to choose pre-viability is enshrined and constitutionally protected, and post-viability, it's left up to the states.
Thank you.
This decision has renewed calls for reforms to the Supreme Court, including term limits for justices and an expansion of the number of justices on the bench. Do you support court reforms? And if so, what specific proposals would you push to implement? Mr. Madden, go first.
Do I support Supreme Court reform?
Yes.
I think that's kind of vague.
I mentioned specifically term limits and
Oh, yes,
expanding.
I support term limits for Supreme Court justices.
Okay. What about expanding the court?
I am not decided on that. I don't think that's my first choice of ways to deal with this issue.
All right. Ms. Tinio.
No, I do not support expanding the court or packing the court, as it is better known as. Our justices are vetted by the Senate. They are elected upon by the Senate. The president puts forth that nomination. The political party that puts them into their position changes, and by expanding the court or packing the court, we would be negating a very important part of our judicial system.
What about term limits?
They are lifetime appointments and they should remain so.
All right, thank you. Ms. Reddick?
Well, I think it's interesting. There's been a lot of conversation tonight, particularly from our opponents on the other political, from the other political persuasion, about preserving our institutions and being concerned about our representative republic and protecting it and protecting our rights. And so when I hear calls to pack the court and do court reform, I find that deeply concerning, because that to me sounds like undermining our democratic institutions. So I do not support that. I think the only thing I might consider would be reminding the Supreme Court that we do not live in an, oh my God, the word just left my brain, an oligarchy. We do not live in an oligarchy. We are not ruled by judges, okay? So they should not be legislating from the bench. Their job is to decide whether or not law is constitutional, not to make new laws when our legislature is unable to pass it the correct way.
Thank you. Our next question. In the first segment, again, you heard candidates referencing revelations from the House committee that's investigating the events of January 6th. Of course, at the center of that are claims by President Trump and others that election fraud led to an illegitimate result in the 2020 presidential election. Those claims have been disproven by journalists, by judges in dozens of court cases, and by federal officials in the Trump administration, yet many Republicans continue to repeat them. I want to know, do you believe the 2020 election results were legitimate? And what effect do you think this kind of rhetoric will have on future elections? Ms. Tinian.
I would hope discussing election fraud would help to secure future elections. We need to have voter identification. We need to have very serious conversations about how to secure our election process. And I would personally like to see a bipartisan committee appointed to oversee the voting machines prior to and just after elections. Those bipartisan committees should be represented by members of both parties that pick those members themselves and send them so that they are convinced within the party that they will work in their best interest. And we need to take very serious steps to secure our elections. I do believe that we have a serious problem with voter fraud and also with foreign interference.
Do you believe in this specific case that the 2020 election results were legitimate?
I think it hasn't been proven either way.
Ms. Reddick, same question.
Would you repeat the question, please?
Sure. Do you believe that the 2020 election results were legitimate? And what effect do you think rhetoric calling into question that legitimacy will have on future elections?
I love the way that you framed this question. Rhetoric is a really good thing that we need to be concerned about. And what's interesting is questioning elections has been going on much longer than 2020. Many of you remember that Democrats contested the 2016 election. We had people contesting the Bush-Gore election. We just didn't have social media back then. And so you are correct when you, in your original saying that it has not been proven in the courts yet. However, there have been polls that have been done that show us that 9.4% of voters in swing states would have changed their vote had they known the Hunter Biden story was true. We also know that many states, including Vermont, changed their voter laws illegally. It is not the responsibility of the Secretary of State and the governor to decide our election procedures, it's the legislatures. So we do have deep concern and we should be very concerned about election integrity.
Can I just ask a brief follow-up question here? Do you believe that the level of questioning around election results that took place in previous presidential election cycles are analogous to the events that we saw of January 2021?
I think the rhetoric around it was significantly different. So the number of senators who opposed the 2016 election was not significantly different than the 2020 election. but there was significantly more rhetoric and much more of this insurrection talk and things like this. And it's the first insurrection I've ever heard of that didn't have any gun charges related to it. So it really didn't seem like an insurrection to me. It seemed like a protest that went wrong. And evidence of that is there were no gun charges. The only people who died that day were protesters, and they were killed by Capitol Police. So when we talk about this, we really need to be honest about what happened that day.
We're going to move on to Mr. Madden. Mr. Madden, same question to you.
I do believe that Joe Biden legitimately won the 2020 election. However, I also believe that the voting and election system in our country is compromised and is vulnerable. And I think evidence of that is the 2000 and 2004 elections. You should watch a documentary called Hacking Democracy. I think voting machines, I would agree with Anya, are something that need to have paper trails, and I agree that in some ways the compromise was a very big picture compromise that was related to the media and the censorship of certain stories that were favorable or not favorable to certain candidates.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Madden, a quick follow-up for you. Your campaign materials state that you oppose the two-party system in politics. Why are you now sitting on a stage in a Republican debate and appearing on Republican ballots in a primary election?
I am very upfront. I am an independent running in the Republican primary, and I'm doing that for the obvious reasons that you have a much better chance in the general election if you start to get attention in the primary process. So that's the primary reason that I'm in the primary. If I could run in both parties' primaries, I would. That's not allowed. However, I do feel like there is some other rationale other than the strategic to be part of the Republican primary, because I think the Republican Party in particular has known what it is like to not be very well represented by the two-party system here in Vermont. So I think there is some alignment on that issue and some other issues as well.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. We will now provide an opportunity for candidates to ask one another questions. Each candidate may ask another candidate of their choosing one question. These should be questions, not speeches. You'll have 60 seconds to answer. We may ask or allow for follow-up questions. Mr. Madden, we'll stay with you.
Erica, so I think, is it fair to say that you would describe yourself as a conservative Republican? And if so, what is your appeal to progressives? Because I have not seen a conservative Republican win in this state in a statewide election. So can you win without appealing to progressives, and what is your appeal to progressives?
I love this question because I actually have some literal, like, people who call themselves socialists and Bernie bros who support my candidacy. Because regardless of what letter you have behind your name, all of us can see that our government officials, our elected officials, have gone too far. We've heard from the stage that they care about bodily autonomy, and yet they will force vaccinate. We hear that they care about housing, and yet they raise taxes. And so people are really starting to see that the progressive and Democrat leadership is not for them and does not have solutions or answers to make things more affordable. And we see that with the increase in prices, we see that with the inflation, the monetary policy, the debt. Anyone is, especially, I'm an accountant, okay? I knew in 2020 when they started sending stimulus checks that this was going to come home to roost. And so everyone wants a new solution because what we have is not working.
All right, actually, we'll stay with you.
Thank you. Anya, in our last debate, I asked you a question. I said, what will you do differently in this election to assure a different outcome? And your answer I found lacking. It didn't sound like there was a lot you were going to do differently. Republicans win about 25% in these races, which is what you won in 2018, and in 2020, you lost the primary election. So what is your assurance to Republican voters that if you win the primary, you will outrun whoever your Democrat opponent is?
My answer that day, and my answer continues to be, that I support the Republican Party, what the Republican voters expect me to support, and that's why I am successful in Republican politics. As far as what I will do differently, I said I won't be doing a whole lot differently as far as policy goes. What I will be doing differently is fundraising, and I will be spending a great deal of money to get my name in front of the public, to give the voters the choice of voting for me. And I think that we have a very, very good opportunity this year to overcome some of the challenges that the Republican Party has faced in the past. Voters are sick and tired of the lack of affordability, the infringement upon their parental rights, their constitutional rights, and I think that we can get those voters to vote Republican. I also will say that Bernie Sanders lost 9 times, and he's sitting in Washington right now. So I don't feel that losing a previous election disqualifies me from being able to win this one.
Yes, go ahead.
So while the political climate is better, and I hear you saying that you're going to do more fundraising, and I'm asking you sincerely as a Vermonter and as a Republican who wants a Republican to win this seat, in the general election, do you have a plan in place? Can you name something that you're going to do differently this year to make sure you get out ahead of the Democrats?
And I understand the sincerity of wanting to make sure that you have a candidate that will win a general election. And I promise you that if you elect me as your representative in the primary, I will go to the general election with a plan to win. I do not intend to enumerate that plan, just for the basic reason that it would provide my opponent, which I believe we saw who that would be on the stage tonight with the Democrats, the opportunity to go against that plan.
All right, Ms. Tenille, you get to go.
Thank you. My question is for Liam. In your campaign materials, you talk about cutting government spending, most significantly with the military. At a time of rising foreign threats, do you feel that you would be unnecessarily endangering military members by cutting their spending at this time?
We spend more on our military than almost every other country in the world combined. If we can't feel safe by spending just more than just being the most expensive military in the world, then we will never feel safe. I think the biggest defender of this republic is the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and we do have a very fine fighting force. I intend to continue to fund that, but it is a completely bloated and corrupt system that also threatens our own democracy.
So you don't believe that you would be unnecessarily placing military members in danger by cutting their budget at a time of rising threats?
I think there is a drastic difference between cutting the budget of contractors like Halliburton and Raytheon, who are spending or charging over 1,000 times what their cost of goods are for weapon systems to our government. We can reduce that and continue to keep our military personnel safe.
Okay.
All right, thank you all. We'll now have another round of questions for each of you. This will be the same drill, 60 seconds for each question, 30 seconds for follow-ups. Ms. Reddick mentioned inflation earlier. We're going to return to the topic now, and I'll repeat the same question that we heard earlier this evening. Americans are struggling with the rising costs of food, fuel, and other goods, and a gas tax holiday pitched by President Biden last week would be expected to have only a minimal impact. If you were in Congress right now, what would you be doing to address the root causes of inflation and provide relief to consumers? Ms. Tinney, we'll start with you.
Thank you. We need to stop the war on American citizens and fossil fuels. It is driving rates up. It is punishing Americans for using fossil fuels when there is no viable alternative. We do not have an infrastructure that can support all electric vehicles, and we do not have realistic path to move away from fossil fuels. Using up our reserves is a mistake. It's a drastic mistake. We should be drilling for our own oil. We should be energy independent, and having a gas tax holiday isn't addressing the real issues, which is going to take real solutions legislated in Washington, D.C. We need to make a change. I hear a lot of talk about people enjoying, the fact that it's under $5 a gallon. I'm not enjoying that it's under $5 a gallon. I remember when it was $2 a gallon, and I intend to bring it back there for all of you and for myself.
I'd like to ask the audience to stop clapping between every question, just for time's sake. They didn't do it every time.
Ms. Reddick, we'll move on to you. Same question.
Okay, let's all be respectful. Can you please repeat the question?
If you were in Congress right now, what would you be doing to address the root causes of inflation and provide relief to consumers?
Great question, since economy is one of my most important topics. Number one, we need to get the pipeline started building again. We need to stop demonizing fossil fuels, stuff that's already been said. We also need major reform to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. We haven't built a new nuclear plant in the United States since 1977. It is the cleanest, safest energy that we can produce, and there is no carbon emission. So we need major reforms to the NRC. The gas tax holiday sounds great, but that means we have less money for our roads and bridges, which the federal government is already robbing from to pay for other stuff anyway. So really what we need to do is have an accountable federal government. We need to cut spending. That is one thing that will help inflation. We need to replace the leadership at the Fed, hashtag abolish the Fed. They are a big reason for why we're seeing the problems that we're seeing today. Basically, we just need new leadership, and we need to start being reasonable and rational with what our options are.
Thank you. Mr. Madden, same question.
I think the first priority should be to increase the cost of living allowances for people who are on fixed incomes, who are most hit hard by inflation, people on Social Security or people on minimum wage. I don't think a gas tax holiday makes as much sense as what Senator Sanders and Senator Warren are proposing, which is a windfall profits tax on large oil companies. But you address the question to the root cause of inflation, which is really about the supply of energy, which I think in the long term it is about aggressively investing in the energy sources of the future, and I do believe nuclear needs to be the central pillar of that. But in the short term, the energy supply was constricted most severely by the war in Ukraine, and that means the best short-term thing we can do is work to negotiate an end to that conflict instead of a cynical policy of extending the conflict in order to weaken a perceived rival.
Thank you.
All right, COVID-19 has killed more than 1 million Americans, and in 2020 it was the third leading cause of death in the United States. But experts have warned that downplaying the risks from COVID and backlash to protective measures, including masks and vaccines, have left the country vulnerable to new variants of the virus, as well as inevitable future pandemics. What would you do to prepare the public for another health crisis? Mr. Madden?
I believe the COVID-19 crisis was, first of all, looking to the roots of it, something that the US government played a role in by funding gain-of-function research in the Wuhan lab in China. So I think stopping the funding of that kind of activity would be first and foremost something I would advocate for. The PCR test that told us how prevalent the disease is in both the New York Times in August of 2020 and in the Journal of Infectious Diseases showed to have an over 95% rate of showing the test to be positive even when the amount of disease in the person was not capable of causing an infection or transmission. So I think there is a viable debate to be had that could be an entire debate about how we should respond to COVID, and I don't think the alarmism that cost a lot of liberties and economic realities to us should be willy-nilly given carte blanche.
All right, Mrs. Reddick.
I love this. These are really good questions.
Thank you.
We are going to continue to see illness. We are human beings and we are susceptible to disease. That is the reality. And in today's environment where we know that our food is less healthy, it's less nutrient dense, when we have more Americans who are obese, overweight, have all kinds of health issues due to our lifestyle, we're going to see worse outcomes from these diseases. I also very much agree, Liam, that we need to not be funding gain of function research. I mean, these literally, this is the stuff of science fiction movies, to the point where they had to take them off of Netflix. So we need to do a better job of taking care of ourselves and our families, our bodies, educating ourselves about healthy food, diet, and also make sure that our government is accountable for not creating disasters.
Okay. All right. We'll next go to Ms. Tinio.
Thank you. Obviously, we want to take measures to mitigate the threat of virus spreading, washing your hands, making healthy choices for your body, all of that. But I'm going to take this in a new direction, and that is one of national security. Unfortunately, the world witnessed how the pandemic shut down our country. And we need to view this as a national security threat and be working very hard through the government function to make sure that we are mitigating threats from other countries who wish to do the same thing. We should also be looking at punishing China for allowing, through negligence or deliberate act, to allow this to spread worldwide and kill over 1 million people. We need to be strong on this. We need to send the message that this will never be tolerated again, and we need to be doing that today. Unfortunately, the current administration refuses to acknowledge the Chinese government's complicity in this, and I would hope that the future administrations would.
Thank you. The Trump administration implemented major tax reforms in 2017. Do you believe the federal tax code needs further changes? And if so, what would be your priorities for reform? Ms. Tinio, you first.
Thank you. I was glad to see the tax reform that took place in 2017, and I think that we could look at it again after we work on reducing government spending. Once we do that, we can look at the needs that we have and see if more reform is necessary, and possibly additional tax cuts for the American people would be possible at that time.
Thank you. Mr. Madden?
I think the tax code should be dramatically simpler. Sorry, that might cut you out of some work there, Erica. But I also think that we should be taxing the wealth, not just the income of the wealthiest people in our country. And it's absurd and obscene that Amazon went several years in a row not paying any corporate tax. So any tax code that allows that to happen needs dramatic reform.
Thank you. Ms. Reddick?
Luckily, I don't do taxes. I'm not that kind of accountant. But I do think we need to have a dramatically simpler tax code. There is no reason that the American public should have to hire me or any of my cohorts and pay them $150, $225, et cetera, so forth, dollars an hour to be able to file their taxes. I think that that's shameful. I think if we're gonna write policy and we're gonna write law in this country, it needs to be done in a way so that Americans can actually read it and understand what the consequences are. And I can tell you right now that our tax code does not do that. It includes a tremendous amount of social engineering. It contains a tremendous amount of kickbacks and breaks for special interests that have been put in place by our legislators. They give their friends deals. And I think any way that we can curb that would be of benefit to the American people.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. We will now provide another opportunity for candidates to ask one another questions. Each candidate may ask another question of their choosing, one question. These should be questions, not speeches. You'll have 60 seconds to answer, and we may ask or allow for follow-up questions. Ms. Reddick, who would you like to query?
I'd like to ask Liam a question.
All right.
So you have stated in public and on your website that you are an independent and that you're running in the primary to get some attention and name ID and things like that. Now, not everyone in Vermont watches these debates, nor do they hear your comments. So, given your willingness to be deceitful by calling yourself a Republican and putting yourself on the Republican ballot, why should Vermonters trust you to not be deceitful when you go to Washington?
I'm not being deceitful at all. I'm being 100% upfront at all times that I'm an independent. In fact, I think that probably helps me significantly in the general election. I think people can trust me because they can trust that I am an independent. I'm not loyal to a party agenda. I'm loyal to the people of Vermont, and I think they can trust me because they've seen that in my life I put my own self-interest in the back seat for the interest of what the ideals this country is meant to uphold.
Thank you.
All right, Ms. Tinio.
Thank you. I'll ask Eric a question. You have been known to say that you knew that nothing would get done in the first year of someone being in Congress, and that was not possible. How do you intend to assure voters that you will be working in their best interest for that first year, rather than just accepting the fact that you may not be able to get anything done?
Oh, I have half a dozen bills at least that will be written and ready to go. I already know who in Congress I will be working with to get those bills passed. Even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wants term limits for federal officials. So talk about working across the aisle and speaking to Liam's question from earlier about working with progressives. So we're going to do term limits for federal officials. We're going to pass, or we're going to submit one bill, one topic, so that every bill that goes through the federal government is one topic, not these 10,000 page long omnibus bills that nobody can read and nobody knows, and then like 5 people vote on it. So I've already got a handful of bills that are going to be ready to go in the first year. I will be working to build coalitions and make relationships, because in this business, everything is about relationships. And like it or not, Democrats are people too. And so we need to get along and we need to work together. And that's what I'll do as Vermont's next Congresswoman.
So then why was it that you stated that you didn't believe you were going to get anything done in the first year?
I've heard repeatedly from elected officials that they have very little power and very little control in their first year until they get committee assignments and things like that. We also need major reform, campaign finance reform. If you don't make enough money, if you don't raise enough money, you don't get put on good committees. They make you pay for that. The Republican Party, the Democrat Party makes their candidates pay to get on committees. You have to donate to the party. So that would be another thing that I would be working to change as Vermont's next Congresswoman.
All right, Mr. Madden.
Erica, this question is for you. That's what I mentioned, that no one in either party talks about, the fact that we have economic growth at 3% over the next 30 years, when we will use the same amount of energy in the next 30 years as we did in the last 10,000. That's not possible. So how do we do that? How do we have a civilization with that kind of energy trajectory without a dramatic paradigm shift in our economy?
I think one of the things would be what I said a couple questions ago, which is we need nuclear energy. Not only do we need nuclear energy, but we need to encourage investment in other alternatives. We know that wind and solar cannot provide the amount of energy that we need. We also know they're made from rare earth minerals and things that are also depleting, like fossil fuels. And so we need to be reasonable, we need to be rational, and first of all, most importantly, we need to remember that we're human beings, and we have constantly innovated and come up with new solutions, new technologies, and new ways to take care of ourselves. They used to talk about, anybody remember the 90s when they talked about peak oil, and we were gonna run out of oil by today, I'm pretty sure. And what they did was innovate. They found new ways to extract, new ways to refine, and I believe that we'll do the same thing with other forms of energy.
thank you. We're going to move on to our final segment here, which is our lightning round. Each of you will have a chance to answer these questions, but please do so in just a few words. You heard us talk about earmarks in the first segment. Do you support the use of earmarks in the federal appropriations process? Ms. Tenniel.
Yes, I do. Unfortunately, the earmarks that have been going forward for Vermont from our current delegation have been mostly feel-good projects and not significant to addressing real issues in our state.
Thank you. Mr. Madden.
I'd prefer not to have them. I'd be okay. I'd tolerate them if there was increased transparency.
Thank you. Ms. Reddick.
I am against earmarks. I think the federal government spends way too much money.
Thank you. Have you ever voted for a Democratic candidate for president, governor, or Congress? If so, whom? Ms. Reddick.
Ooh, oh wait, did you say for Congress or president?
President, governor, or Congress?
My first vote when I was 18, some people are probably gonna hate me for this, but my first vote when I was 18 was for Bill Clinton. I was 18.
Thank you. Mr. Madden.
Yes.
If so, whom?
Oh, Bernie Sanders.
Okay.
Many.
Ms. Tenniel.
No, I have not.
Okay. Should members of Congress be prohibited from buying and selling individual stocks? Mr. Madden.
I support that. I support banning the selling of individual stocks.
Ms. Reddick.
I think so. I would want to know how exactly that was written, because I think you should be able to buy stock as long as it's not in any of your committees and you're not committing insider trading, which desperately needs to be curbed by our elected officials. Check out Nancy Pelosi's portfolio, you'll get rich.
Ms. Tenniel.
I think that insider trading is something that we do need to be concerned with, as with Nancy Pelosi and Tesla, et cetera. I do not think that we should prohibit members of Congress from buying stocks, but we could put a limitation, as companies do, on the windows surrounding when they can sell or buy stocks if major legislation is coming through.
Thank you. Are you vaccinated against COVID-19? Ms. Reddick.
Hey, we're grown, we can take care of ourselves. My personal medical information is my personal medical information, and I choose not to share that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Madden.
I'm going to take the opportunity to talk a second about what I should have said about COVID, which is that the head of epidemiology at Harvard, Oxford, and Stanford all agree that there is a more rational way to approach protecting the vulnerable and not having mandates, censorship, and lockdowns as public health policy. And I'm going to side with Erica. This is my personal medical decision, and
It's my personal decision, and I choose not to disclose it.
We will repeat the last question from our reader, Elizabeth Hirsch of Windsor. What issue are you willing to lose this election over? Ms. Tenniel.
I'm willing to lose the election over the right to life. And I would like to ask my two colleagues if they would be willing to answer when they believe life begins.
that's a deeply philosophical question. I stand by the fact that viability of an embryo outside of a mother's body is when states should have the ability to legislate on that.
To your question, I will lose this election over constitutional rights. I'm a constitutional conservative, and I believe that the individual and the states, but particularly the individual, come first, period. And that goes to any controversial question.
Do you wish to answer Ms. Tenniel's question? It's up to you.
Well, sure. I would like to preface it, though. May I?
If you can keep it brief. Thank you.
I will. I think any reasonable person knows that if a single-celled organism were found on Mars, the headline would read, "Life found on Mars." Scientists agree that life begins at conception. And the conversation we're having right now is whether or not that life deserves protection under our Constitution and our laws. So you can disagree that life begins at conception, but the real conversation that we're having with this abortion stuff is whether or not that life is worth preserving and protecting. You can disagree with that, but again, single-celled organisms are life, and so life begins at conception.
Thank you. We'll return to the question of what issue are you willing to lose this election over? I think, Mr. Madden, you're our last person to answer that question.
I believe we need to liberate ourselves from the two-party system. It does not solve our problems. It does not represent us. It drives us apart. And
yet here you are.
that's absurd. If you want to win in this election, you need to get in front of voters, and that is why I'm here, and that is clear.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, that concludes VTDigger's second U.S. House debate. Please stay tuned to VTDigger.org to learn about upcoming events in the 2022 Digger Debate Series. I would like to thank all 7 candidates for joining us tonight, as well as the VTDigger staffers who made this possible, including Paul Heinz, Sarah Meerhoff, Natalie Williams, Kate Olney, Libby Johnson, Taylor Haynes, Leah Chen, and Jenna Peterson. Thanks as well to everyone here at the Double E Performance Theater and Town Meeting TV. To support our coverage of Vermont government and politics, please visit vtdigger.org/donate. Thank you again and good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all for coming. I very much appreciate it.